Customer abuses employee with Down syndrome at a flower shop not knowing Robert Downey Jr. was behind her. The bell above the flower shop's door chimed softly as Robert Downey Jr. stepped inside, the faint aroma of roses and lavender instantly filling the air. It wasn't the kind of place people expected to see him, a small, family-run flower shop on a quiet corner of town. But that's exactly why he loved it. It was simple, peaceful, and far away from the flashing cameras and loud voices of Hollywood. Wearing a plain gray hoodie and jeans, with a baseball cap pulled low, he looked like any other customer. That was how he liked it. Robert casually browsed the rows of colorful bouquets, his fingers brushing lightly over the petals of sunflowers and tulips. He wasn't here for anything fancy, just a small bouquet to brighten someone's day. It was the kind of gesture he believed in, small but meaningful. As he moved further into the shop, his attention was caught by a soft voice at the counter. "Would you like me to wrap these for you?" the employee asked, his tone kind but slightly hesitant. The young man, probably in his early 20s, he stood behind the register, his hands carefully arranging a bouquet of daisies. His name tag read Eli, and it was clear he took pride in his work, even if his movements were slower than most. The customer at the counter, a middle-aged woman in a sharp red jacket, rolled her eyes dramatically. "Seriously, how long is this going to take?" she snapped, her voice loud enough to echo through the cozy shop. "I don't have all day, and you're moving like a snail." Robert's gaze shifted to the scene unfolding in front of him. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he tried to speed up, fumbling with the ribbon he was tying around the bouquet. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said softly, his cheeks turning pink. "I'll be done in just a moment." "That's not good enough," the woman barked, slamming her purse onto the counter. "This is why people don't hire folks like you. You can't even do something as simple as this without messing it up." Robert felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had been in countless tense situations, on and off the big screen, but this was different. The woman's words weren't just rude, they were cruel. The kind of cruelty that cuts deep, especially for someone like Eli, who was clearly doing his best. Eli's shoulders hunched as he continued working, his head lowered as if he was trying to make himself smaller. Robert took a slow breath, his mind racing. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, but he couldn't just stand by and let this happen. The woman, still fuming, crossed her arms and glanced around the shop as if looking for someone to back her up. Her eyes briefly met Robert's, but she didn't recognize him, at least not yet. "Unbelievable," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I came here to save time, not to wait forever while some incompetent kid tries to figure out how to do his job." Eli's hands faltered, the bouquet slipping slightly before he caught it. I'm almost done," he said quietly, his voice trembling. He looked up briefly, his eyes meeting Robert's for just a second. In that brief moment, Robert saw the pain and embarrassment in Eli's expression. It was the look of someone who had heard words like this before, who had been made to feel small and unimportant. The woman huffed and tapped her foot impatiently, her frustration growing by the second. "I should have gone to the big florist downtown," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "At least they know how to hire competent staff." Robert's jaw tightened. He had seen a lot in his life, fame, fortune, and all the chaos that came with it. But nothing made his blood boil more than seeing someone treated unfairly, especially when they couldn't defend themselves. He stepped closer, pretending to examine a bouquet of lilies on a nearby shelf. His ears stayed tuned to the conversation at the counter, his mind already forming a plan. "Ma'am, I can call someone to help if—" Eli started. But the woman cut him off. "Don't bother," she snapped. "I don't need help. I need you to do your job and stop wasting my time. Honestly, I don't know why they even let people like you work here." Eli flinched at her words, his face turning pale. Robert set the bouquet back on the shelf and straightened up. Enough was enough. The woman didn't notice as Robert took a step closer, his calm, steady presence inching into the tense bubble of the confrontation. He wasn't the type to raise his voice or cause a scene, but there was a certain weight in the way he carried himself, a quiet strength that couldn't be ignored. As Robert stood just a few feet behind the woman, his eyes locked on Eli's, offering a silent but firm reassurance. Eli's gaze flickered toward him, his breathing a little steadier now, as if he could sense that help was near. The bell above the door chimed again, but the tense atmosphere in the shop remained heavy. Everyone in the small space could feel it. Something was about to happen. The woman drummed her fingers on the counter, her irritation filling the quiet flower shop like a storm cloud. She seemed oblivious to how uncomfortable she was making everyone, her sharp voice cutting through the calm atmosphere. "Can't you just hurry up? It's not rocket science," she snapped, glaring at Eli as if her words would somehow make him move faster. Eli's hands trembled as he finished tying the ribbon around the bouquet. He glanced nervously at the woman CEO, then back down at his work. His lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm really sorry, ma'am," he murmured. "I'm almost done." "Sorry isn't going to cut it," the woman shot back, her tone dripping with disdain. "This is why you shouldn't hire people who can't keep up. If you can't do the job, you shouldn't be here in the first place." Robert Downey Jr., still standing near the shelf of lilies, clenched his jaw. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the quiet anger that always came when he saw someone being mistreated. He wasn't one to get involved in every little thing, but this wasn't just some minor inconvenience. This was someone taking their frustration out on a kid who clearly didn't deserve it. Robert's sharp eye for detail took in everything about the scene. The way Eli's shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself invisible, the slight tremor in his hands as he worked, and the nervous glances he kept stealing toward the woman. The kid was doing his best, but it was obvious the woman's harsh words were getting to him. The woman, meanwhile, had fully embraced her role as the antagonist. She crossed her arms and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, turning to glance at the handful of other customers in the shop. "Can you believe this?" she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've been standing here forever, and he still can't get it right." Most of the other customers avoided eye contact, either pretending to browse or quietly edging toward the door. No one wanted to get involved, but their uncomfortable silence only seemed to embolden the woman. She turned back to Eli, her expression hard and unforgiving. "Maybe this just isn't the right job for you," she said, her voice icy. "Have you thought about that?" Eli didn't respond, his head bowed as he focused on finishing the bouquet. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking so badly now that he struggled to tie the final knot. Robert could see the humiliation etched into every line of the young man's face. It wasn't just the woman's words, it was the weight of being treated like this in front of a room full of strangers. Robert took a step forward, his hands slipping into the pockets of his hoodie. He wasn't sure what he was going to say yet, but he knew he couldn't just stand by any longer. As he moved closer, the woman glanced over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she took him in. "Can I help you?" she asked sharply, her tone making it clear she didn't think he belonged in the conversation. "Because if you're here to complain about the service too, get in line." Robert tilted his head slightly, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Actually," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I think you've already made enough noise for all of us." The woman blinked, taken aback by his response. She clearly wasn't used to being called out, especially not by someone who didn't look the least bit intimidated by her. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice rising. "What's that supposed to mean?" Robert shrugged, his expression still calm. "It means you're making a scene, and it's not helping anyone, least of all him." He nodded toward Eli, who had paused mid-motion, his wide eyes flicking nervously between Robert and the woman. The woman turned fully to face Robert now, her hands on her hips. "Listen, buddy," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't any of your business. I'm just pointing out the obvious. If he can't do the job, he shouldn't be here." Robert raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "And you think it's your job to decide that?" he asked, his tone steady but pointed. "Because from where I'm standing, It looks like he's doing just fine. You're the one making this harder than it needs to be." The woman scoffed, clearly annoyed that someone had dared to challenge her. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes. "Don't act like you know what's going on here. This isn't about you." Robert smiled slightly, his hands still in his pockets. "You're right," he said. "It's not about me. It's about him." He gestured toward Eli, who was watching the exchange with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "And I think he deserves a little more respect than what you're giving him." The tension in the shop was palpable now, the air heavy with anticipation. The other customers, who had been pretending not to watch, were now openly staring, their curiosity piqued. Even Eli seemed frozen in place, his hands clutching the bouquet as if it were a lifeline. Robert took another step closer, his voice dropping slightly but losing none of its intensity. "Look, we all have bad days," he said, his eyes locked on the woman's. "But that doesn't give you the right to take it out on someone who's just trying to do their job." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but for once, no words came out. She stared at Robert, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. The balance of power in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The bell above. The door chimed again, but no one turned to look. All eyes were on Robert and the woman, the tension building toward a moment that was impossible to ignore. The silence in the shop was almost deafening now. The woman's face was flushed, with irritation, her arms crossed so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "You've got some nerve," she said, narrowing her eyes at Robert. "If you think you're going to lecture me about how to handle bad service, you're wasting your breath." Robert met her glare with calm composure, his hands still tucked casually into his hoodie pockets. "I'm not here to lecture, Huey," he said simply. "I'm just saying that yelling at the kid isn't going to fix anything. It's just cruel." The word hung in the air for a moment, heavier than the woman had expected. Cruel. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the shop. A few of the other customers quickly looked away, pretending to examine the bouquets or fiddle with their phones. But the tension in their body language gave them away. They were paying attention. "I'm not being cruel," the woman retorted, her voice sharp. "I'm just being honest. Someone needs to tell him the truth. If you can't handle honesty, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you shouldn't mistake cruelty for honesty." Robert interrupted, his tone steady but firm. His words were quiet, yet they cut through the woman's defenses like a blade. "There's a difference, you know." Eli, still standing behind the counter, looked up briefly. His hands were no longer working on the bouquet. Instead, he clutched it tightly to his chest, as though it were a shield against the harsh words being thrown around. His face was pale, but his eyes were wide with something that wasn't quite fear anymore. Maybe it was hope. The woman let out an exasperated laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, give me a break. You're really going to stand there and make me the bad guy? I'm just trying to get what I paid for. Is that too much to ask?" Robert tilted his head slightly, studying her. "What you're asking for isn't unreasonable," he said, his voice still calm. "It's how you're asking for it that's the problem. You could have just been patient. Instead, you chose to attack someone who's already trying their best." For a moment, the woman didn't respond. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she searched for a comeback, but Robert didn't give her the chance to find one. He gestured toward Eli, his expression softening. "Look at him. He's doing everything he can to help you, and you're treating him like he's not even human." The woman followed Robert's gesture, her eyes landing on Eli. For the first time, she seemed to really see him. The way his hands shook as he held the bouquet, the redness in his eyes that suggested he was fighting back tears, the way he stood so still, as if moving would make him a target again. Her gaze flickered, a moment of hesitation breaking through her hardened exterior. But it didn't last long. She straightened her shoulders and huffed. "Look, I don't know why you're making this such a big deal," she said. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking. If you can't handle criticism, lady, that's enough." A voice from the back of the shop interrupted her this time, and all heads turned to see a middle-aged man with a kind face and a baseball cap stepping forward. He had been standing near the potted plants, watching the scene unfold quietly. But now he looked ready to speak his mind. "You're embarrassing yourself," the man said bluntly. "You're not just being rude, you're being mean. And for what? 'Cause the kid's taking an extra minute to wrap your flowers?" The woman's eyes widened in shock. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising. "Who do you think you are? Someone who's had just about enough of your attitude." The man replied, crossing his arms. He looked at Eli and gave him a small, encouraging nod. "You're doing great, son. Don't let her get to you." Eli blinked, his grip on the bouquet loosening slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The murmurs of agreement from other customers started to rise. A young woman near the door chimed in. "Yeah, he's doing fine. You're the only one making this a problem." Another customer nodded, muttering, "It's just flowers. What's the rush?" The woman's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and for a moment, she looked like she might lash out again. But before she could, Robert stepped in once more. "I think you've made your point," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Now, why don't we let Eli finish his work in peace?" The woman opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly unsure of how to respond. The weight of the room was against her now, the quiet solidarity of strangers making it clear that her behavior wasn't welcome. Robert turned back to Eli, giving him a small smile. "Take your time," he said gently. "You're doing a great job." Eli's hand stopped trembling as much, and he nodded, his lips curving, into a faint, grateful smile. He returned to wrapping the bouquet, his movements a little steadier now, while the woman stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The air in the flower shop shifted again, the tension easing slightly as the other customers began to relax. But Robert could feel it. A storm was still brewing, and the woman wasn't done yet. Eli carefully placed the finished bouquet on the counter, the ribbon tied neatly around the stems. He looked up at the woman with cautious eyes and said softly, "Here you go, ma'am. I hope you like it." The woman didn't respond immediately. Her lips were pressed into a tight line, and her eyes flicked from Eli to the bouquet, as if she were debating whether to find something else to criticize. Finally, she let out a heavy sigh and reached for her purse. "Fine," she muttered. "At least it's done." Before she could pull out her wallet, Robert took a step closer to the counter, his presence impossible to ignore now. He leaned slightly against the edge, his relaxed posture belying the quiet intensity in his eyes. "Hold on a second," he said, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge of authority. The woman looked up sharply, clearly annoyed. "What now?" she snapped. "Haven't you caused enough trouble?" Robert ignored the question, his gaze fixed on Eli. "Can I see that bouquet for a moment?" he asked, his tone so gentle it took Eli a second to realize he was being addressed. Sure," Eli said hesitantly, sliding the bouquet toward him. Robert picked it up with careful hands, turning it slightly as he examined the arrangement. The flowers were vibrant and perfectly arranged, the ribbon tied with precision. He nodded in approval, then turned to the woman. "You see this," he said, holding up the bouquet. "This is the work of someone who cares." The woman frowned, clearly unimpressed. "It's a bunch of flowers," she said dismissively. "What's your point?" "My point," Robert said, setting the bouquet back on the counter, "is that he didn't just throw this together. He took his time to make sure it was right, even while you were breathing down his neck." The woman crossed her arms and let out a derisive laugh. "Oh, please," she said. "Are you seriously going to stand there and act like this is some kind of masterpiece? It's not like he's solving world hunger. He's wrapping flowers." Robert's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Maybe it's just flowers to you," he said. "But to him, it's a job he takes pride in. And if you can't see that, maybe the problem isn't him. Maybe it's you." The woman opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, another voice broke through the tension. "Wait a second." It was the young woman who had spoken up earlier, standing near the door. Her phone was raised slightly, the screen glowing. Are you Robert Downey Jr.?" A ripple of surprise spread through the shop. Heads turned, and eyes widened as the realization sank in. The man in the gray hoodie, who had been quietly standing up for Eli, wasn't just some random customer. He was one of the most famous actors in the world. The woman's jaw dropped. "What?" she said, her voice a mix of confusion and disbelief. "You're kidding, right?" Robert sighed softly, a small, self-conscious smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said, shrugging. "It's me." The room seemed to hold its breath. The customers, who had been pretending not to pay attention, were now openly staring. Even Eli looked stunned, his mouth slightly open as he processed what he had just heard. The woman, however, was not so easily convinced. She squinted, dim, as if trying to find a flaw in his appearance that would prove he wasn't who he claimed to be. "If you're really him," she said skeptically, "what are you doing in a place like this?" Robert raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I like flowers," he said simply, "and I like places where people treat each other with respect. Guess I came to the wrong place today." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd, and the woman's face flushed with embarrassment. She glanced around as if looking for support, but all she found were disapproving looks and quiet whispers. "You're really him," someone else said, a young man near the potted plants. "Man, I didn't even recognize you at first." Robert gave a small nod, his smile modest. "Yeah, that's kind of the idea," he said. "But this isn't about me, it's about him." He gestured toward Eli, who was still standing behind the counter, looking both awestruck and deeply moved. The woman stared at Robert, her earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of the situation. "I didn't realize," she began, her voice trailing off. "Didn't realize what?" Robert asked, his tone still calm but carrying a sharper edge now. "That the guy you've been yelling at is just a kid trying to do his job, or that other people were watching." The woman's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked down at the counter, suddenly unable to meet Robert's gaze. Robert let out a slow breath and turned back to Eli. "You okay, bud?" he asked gently. Eli nodded quickly, though his voice was shaky when he replied, Yeah, I'm okay." Robert smiled at him, the kind of smile that felt like a warm blanket on a cold day. "Good," he said, "because you're doing great. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The shop was silent again, but this time the air felt different. The tension was gone, replaced by something softer, something closer to hope. The woman shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between Robert and Eli. For the first time, she seemed to realize just how out of line she had been. But the weight of her actions had already shifted the room, and there was no going back. "Ow." The woman stood frozen, her earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of the room's collective disapproval. Her eyes darted from Robert to Eli, then back to the bouquet on the counter. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something, apologize maybe, or try to defend herself. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached for her purse, her movements stiff and awkward. "Here," she muttered, pulling out a few bills and slapping them onto the counter. "Keep the change." Eli hesitated, glancing at the money, then at Robert, as if unsure what to do. Robert gave him a small nod, a silent reassurance that it was okay to take it. Eli reached for the bills, his hands still trembling slightly, and placed them in the cash register. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond. She grabbed the bouquet and turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. But before she reached the door, Robert's voice stopped her. "Hey," he said, his tone calm but firm. "You forgot something." She paused, her back stiffening. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression a mix of irritation and uncertainty. "What?" she snapped, though her voice lacked its earlier bite. Robert tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "You forgot to say thank you." The woman blinked, caught off guard. For a moment, it looked like she might argue, but then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a heavy sigh. "Fine," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." Robert nodded, his expression softening. And maybe next time, try a little patience. It goes a long way. The woman didn't reply. She turned on her heel and walked out of the shop, the bell above the door chiming softly as it closed behind her. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension dissipating like a storm cloud passing overhead. Robert turned back to Eli, who was still standing behind the counter, looking a little dazed. "You okay?" Robert asked, his voice gentle. Eli nodded, though his eyes were still wide with disbelief. "Yeah," he said quietly. I can't believe you're really him." Robert chuckled, a warm, easy sound that filled the room. "Yeah, well, I'm just a guy who likes flowers," he said, shrugging. "But you're the real star here. You handled that like a pro." Eli's cheeks flushed, and he looked down at his hands, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't do much," he said. "I just tried not to mess up." "And you didn't," Robert said firmly. "You kept your cool, even when she was being, well, you know, that's not easy to do." Eli glanced up at him, his smile growing a little wider. "Thanks," he said. "That means a lot." The other customers, who had been quietly watching the exchange, began to murmur among themselves. A few of them stepped forward, offering Eli encouraging words or compliments on the shop's flowers. One woman even asked if she could take a photo with Robert, who obliged with his usual charm. As the shop buzzed with renewed energy, Robert leaned against the counter, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the tension replaced by a sense of camaraderie, the harsh words drowned out by kindness. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. Eli, emboldened by the support, began to chat with the customers, his earlier nervousness fading. He even laughed at a joke someone made, the sound light and genuine. Robert watched him for a moment, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. "You've got a good thing going here," Robert said, turning to the shop's owner, who had been standing quietly in the background. The older man, who had introduced himself as Eli's uncle, nodded with a grateful smile. "We try," he said. "Eli's a hard worker. He doesn't deserve to be treated like that." "No one does," Robert replied, "but it's how we handle it that matters. And today, Eli showed a lot of strength." The owner nodded again, his eyes shining with pride. "He did, and we're lucky to have him." Robert glanced back at Eli, who was now helping a customer choose a bouquet of roses. The young man's confidence was growing with each passing moment, his earlier humiliation replaced by a quiet determination. The bell above the door chimed again as a few customers left, their arms full of flowers and their spirits lifted. Robert stayed for a while longer, chatting with Eli and the other customers, his presence bringing a sense of calm and positivity to the shop. But as the afternoon wore on, Robert knew it was time to go. He gave Eli one last smile and a pat on the shoulder. "Keep up the good work," he said. "And remember, you're stronger than you think." Eli nodded, his smile genuine. "Thanks, Mr. Downey. I won't forget this." Robert waved as he headed for the door, the bell chiming softly once more. He stepped out into the sunlight, the scent of flowers still lingering in the air. It had been an unexpected detour, but one that left him feeling lighter, more hopeful. As Robert walked down the quiet street, his hands in his pockets, he couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. The world was full of moments like these, small and everyday interactions that could either build people up or tear them down. And too often, it was the latter that won out. But today, in that little flower shop, something had shifted. A moment of cruelty had been met with kindness, and a young man had been reminded of his worth. It wasn't a grand gesture or a life-changing event, but it mattered. Those small moments, Robert realized, were the ones that truly made a difference. He thought about Eli, his quiet strength, his determination to do his best even when faced with unfairness, and he thought about the woman, her frustration and anger masking something deeper, something she probably didn't even understand. Everyone had their struggles, their bad days, but how they chose to handle them, that's what defined them. Robert paused at the corner, glancing back at the flower shop. Through the window, he could see Eli helping another customer, his movements confident and assured. The shop felt alive, vibrant, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled it just an hour earlier. He smiled to himself, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. It wasn't about being a hero or making a big scene. It was about showing, standing up for what was right, and reminding people of their humanity. And if he could do that, even in small ways, then maybe the world could be a little better. As he turned to walk away, Robert made a silent promise to himself. He would keep looking for those moments, those chances to make a difference. Because in the end, it wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about the impact you had on others. And maybe, just maybe, others would do the same.